In the wake of heresy, the galaxy bled. The throne world of humanity, Holy Terra, stood not in triumph, but in ruin. Its skies were choked with the ash of orbital bombardments. Spires, once monuments to the Emperor's glory, lay as broken bones amid oceans of rubble. The palace, the heart of mankind's dominion, had withstood the greatest siege in history. But the cost had been unfathomable. Millions of defenders lay dead. Civilian corpses clogged shattered corridors. And at the very center of it all, the Emperor of mankind, wounded beyond mortal ken, was bound eternally to the Golden Throne. There was no victory. There was only survival. The galaxy reeled from the betrayal of Horus, the War Master, once beloved by all. The Horus Heresy, 7 years of internecine bloodshed, had torn the Imperium apart. The War Master was slain, yes, cut down by the Emperor in the final, apocalyptic duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit. But the price had been almost everything. The Emperor's last act, before silence consumed him, was not conquest or command, but sacrifice. His shattered form was placed within the Golden Throne by Rogal Dorn, the loyal son who had found his father dying among the wreckage. And thus, the age of the Imperium began. Not with a coronation, but with mourning. The traitors had fled, harried and beaten, into the warp-strewn corners of the galaxy. But they were not destroyed. The threat remained, festering like an infection. The shattered legions of Horus scattered into the Eye of Terror, dragging with them billions of cultists, mutants, and renegades. Their Primarchs, warped and twisted by the gods of the Immaterium, would rise again. And so began the Great Scouring, an era not of healing but of vengeance. The Loyalist legions turned their wrath upon the retreating traitors. There would be no mercy, but vengeance, as it so often is, was not simple, not clean. Within this crucible of fire and broken ideals, a reckoning brewed, one not yet written in the histories of the Mechanicum or etched into the hallowed data vaults of the Inquisition. A reckoning born not merely of betrayal, but of pride, grief, and the terrible burden of loyalty. Its roots reached deep into the hearts of 2 legions, both masters of fortification, both sons of the same emperor, and both sworn enemies since the earliest days of the Great Crusade. At the center of this gathering storm stood the 7th Legion, the Imperial Fists. Once they had been the architects of the Emperor's dream, builders of bastions, wardens of humanity, proud warriors clad in yellow and devotion. They had fought on 1,000 worlds, erecting towers and citadels as they pushed the Imperium's frontier forward. They were defenders by nature, champions of stoic endurance. And at their head stood Rogal Dorn, the Praetorian of Terra, a Primarch carved from granite, unbending, unyielding, loyal beyond reason. Dorn had not hesitated when the call came to defend the throne world. It was his honor to prepare the palace's defenses. He built walls not merely of stone, but of resolve. And when Horus came, Dorn did not waver. He watched brothers fall. He endured the endless attrition. He stood on the battlements and defied the War Master's legions, even as the sky turned to fire. And when all was done, when Sanguinius had fallen, and the Emperor was no more than a whisper on the throne, it was Dorn who bore the Emperor's broken body through the blood-slicked halls. He never forgave himself. The war was won, but for Rogal Dorn, there was no peace. He had failed. That failure was etched into every death he could not prevent, every wall that broke beneath traitor guns, every life lost to the ambition of his wayward brothers. The heresy had been the failure of Primarchs, and Rogal Dorn, who had always seen duty as sacred, took the burden upon himself. While others turned to rebuilding, Dorn turned to war. Where Robout Guilliman withdrew to Ultramar and began codifying a new order for the Imperium, Dorn gathered his sons and disappeared into the void. The Imperial Fists did not wait for orders or counsels. They hunted. They scoured the stars for any stronghold, fortress, or redoubt still bearing the mark of the traitor. They laid siege to the ruins of rebellion and razed them to dust. There was no negotiation, no parley. Dorn had become the Emperor's executioner in all but name. It was during this era, the desperate sweep of the Scouring, that whispers of an impossible fortress began to spread. A fortress not built by the Imperium, but by the traitor Primarch Perturabo, Dorn's most bitter rival. The Iron Warriors, masters of siege and cruelty, had carved a bastion on a forgotten world. It was said to span miles, said to be impregnable, said to have been built for one purpose, to lure the Imperial Fists to their doom. And Dorn, upon hearing it, felt a strange certainty settle over him. He had not yet paid the price. There are battles that shape the fate of empires, and there are those that shape the souls of men. The Iron Cage would become both. But before that crucible of blood and iron, there was this. The void left behind. The silence that followed terror, the long shadow cast by victory, bought with godhood lost. In the wake of heresy, the Imperium did not celebrate. It trembled. And in the darkness of that silence, two Primarchs began a march that would bring them face to face one last time. Music swells, ominous and slow. The traitor had built a fortress. The loyal son had sworn to tear it down. And somewhere amid the ruins of their brotherhood, the Iron Cage waited. They called him the Praetorian. Not because he sought power or desired command above his brothers, but because the Emperor had placed Terra in his hands. And Rogal Dorn never let go of what was given to him. While others reveled in conquest or ceremony, Dorn embraced duty like a second skin. Unbending, methodical, unyielding, he was the iron foundation upon which the Emperor built his last redoubt. And yet, in the quiet wake of the Siege of Terra, that title weighed heavier than any mantle a Primarch had worn. For Dorn had not only been the architect of the palace's defenses, he had been its warden during mankind's darkest hour. It was he who measured every stone, traced every gun line, and drew every killing corridor. It was he who walked the ramparts with bolter in hand, as demon spawn and gene-warped traitors clawed at the very walls he had built. Dorn, of all his brothers, had witnessed every horror the traitors unleashed. And in the end, it was he who climbed the blood-slicked ruin of the vengeful spirit to find his father broken and silent. There was no ceremony, no triumph, only a failing heart encased in golden armor and a dying god's whisper of duty. Rogal Dorn had always believed there was honor in loyalty. That duty fulfilled would bring clarity. But clarity never came. In the stillness that followed, there was only pain. He did not speak of it, not to Guilliman, not to Malcador. No, especially not to Malcador. But those closest to Dorn saw it, a distance in his eyes, a sharpening in his resolve. He had not forgiven himself for what had happened on Terra. Every breach in the palace walls haunted him. Every brother lost weighed heavier than any fortress stone. And though none dared say it aloud, all knew that Dorn had taken the Emperor's wounding as a personal failure. So, while Guilliman and others turned to rebuilding the Imperium's shattered bureaucracy, Dorn turned away. He refused the summons to Terra's high command, refused counsel, refused rest. The Imperial Fists did not return to garrison the palace they had bled for. Instead, they vanished into the stars. They had not forgotten the traitors who had fled. The Scouring was not merely vengeance for the 7th Legion, it was penance. Each world reclaimed, each fortress pulled down stone by stone, was another lash across their own backs. They moved like revenants from the old night, grim and wordless, executing their campaigns with brutal precision. Dorn himself led from the front, clad in battle plate, still scarred from the Siege of Terra, wielding the mighty chainsword Storm's Teeth, with fury few had ever witnessed in the cold Primarch. His voice, always commanding, now carried an edge of finality. Orders were given like eulogies, and still the burden grew heavier. Those under his command whispered of changes. He no longer walked among his warriors between battles. His meditation chambers aboard the phalanx echoed with the sound of steel striking steel. He had begun reforging the Legion's weapons himself, hammering each blade as though willing it to endure more than he had. The Pain Glove, a device used by the Fists to atone and contemplate failure, became his frequent refuge. While Guilliman drafted tomes and Lorgar vanished into the warp, Dorn bled behind closed doors. To the wider Imperium, the Imperial Fists became a ghost legion. Entire systems reported the yellow-armored giants appearing without warning, scouring ancient traitor fortresses, executing orbital bombardments with no demands issued and no quarter given. The Fists did not tarry. They razed the structures and left. In their wake only ash and silence, and Dorn always moved them onward. He never allowed a world to be held, only broken. This was not strategy, it was ritual. The traitors had broken faith with the Emperor, but to Dorn the greater failure was his own. He had not held the walls, and so now he would tear down everyone that bore the mark of treachery. When the word came of Perturabo's survival, the silence that followed in Dorn's strategium was thunderous. The Iron Warriors, those twisted reflections of the Imperial Fists, had not only survived, but fortified themselves anew. Where Dorn sought to unmake his failures, Perturabo sought to immortalize his hatred. It was fitting. They had always been at odds. Perturabo, master of entrenchment, who saw beauty in brutal geometry and cruelty in calculation. Dorn, the defensive savant, who built walls to shield, not torment. Their rivalry had begun long before the heresy, on Olympia, on Fall, in the chambers of council where Perturabo's bitterness boiled over. Even before Horus fell, these two had stared across a gulf of pride and principle that could not be crossed. And now the gulf had become a chasm. Dorn did not speak Perturabo's name aloud when he heard of the so-called Eternal Fortress. He simply marked the coordinates on the holomap and issued orders. Sebastus IV. That was where they would go. But before that fateful journey, there was another weight to bear. Guilliman had returned to Terra, bearing a new vision for the Legiones Astartes, a vision Dorn could not accept. The Codex Astartes, Guilliman's grand tome, called for the dismantling of the legions into smaller chapters. Dorn saw it as betrayal, disarmament through protocol, a bureaucrat's panic in response to Horus, not a warrior's wisdom. He argued fiercely, relentlessly. His defiance brought the Imperium to the brink of another war, loyal sons of the Emperor, nearly drawing blades over how to prevent the rise of another war master. It was Malcador's absence and the Emperor's silence that made things worse. The weight of decision rested on the living Primarchs, and none bore the weight more heavily than Dorn. He withdrew from the debate only after a period of self-inflicted penitence. 7 days in the Pain Glove, 7 days without food, sleep, or reprieve. What he saw within himself during that time was never recorded, never spoken of. But when Dorn emerged, his silence was final. He would accept the Codex, but not yet. There would be a trial first, one final act to define the Legion before it was broken. And Dorn, though he said nothing, already knew what that trial would be. The Praetorian of Terra had spent his entire life building fortresses to keep the enemy out. Now he would tear down one that dared keep him in. The iron cage awaited, and with it, the last true test of Rogal Dorn's burden. They had never been brothers in spirit, even before the galaxy burned. Rogal Dorn and Perturabo were carved from the same genetic mold, shaped by the same godlike hand, and yet they were destined to loathe each other. Their hatred was not born in the fires of betrayal. It was something older, something colder. A rivalry long buried beneath oaths and duty, ignored during the days of the Great Crusade, but never extinguished. The flames had always been there, flickering behind their eyes when they shared the same war council, when they built upon the same world, when one was praised and the other passed over. They were alike in many ways, and that was precisely why they could not coexist. Both were builders. Both were siege masters. Both could reduce a fortress to rubble or raise one from nothing with mathematical elegance. But Dorn built to protect, to preserve. He raised fortifications as symbols of hope and order. Perturabo built to dominate. To him, a fortress was not a shield. It was a cage for enemies, a trap waiting to be sprung. Where Dorn built walls to save lives, Perturabo built them to break spirits. It was during the Great Crusade that this divide began to fester. As the Emperor's vision swept across the galaxy, the legions followed like the blades of an ever-grinding scythe. There were countless worlds to conquer, Xenos empires to erase, and bastions to storm. Dorn and the Imperial Fists took pride in building up the Imperium's defenses in the wake of conquest. They were the consolidators, the restorers. Each bastion they left behind bore the mark of precision and purpose, a testament to their devotion. Perturabo watched from the shadows of shattered strongholds, his Fourth Legion the specialists in siegecraft, tasked with destroying what others could not breach. But where the Imperial Fists received glory and honor, the Iron Warriors were sent where the grinding war was ugliest, where there was no spectacle, only attrition, where the cost of victory was measured in corpses. Time and again, Perturabo watched Dorn hailed as a genius, while he received orders to bleed his sons dry against impossible odds. Resentment, slow and poisonous, began to consume the Lord of Iron. Inwardly, Perturabo began to believe that his worth was being denied, that the Emperor himself failed to understand the true cost of victory. He began to see the praise lavished on Dorn as a deliberate slight. Every laurel placed on the brow of the 7th Legion was a blade in Perturabo's pride. When Dorn was chosen to design the defenses of Terra, when the Emperor named him Praetorian, it was not simply favoritism to Perturabo, it was betrayal. That decision cemented the rift. The moment Dorn was named Defender of the Throne World, Perturabo's loyalty began to unravel. Fulgrim, ever the provocateur, had once joked at a gathering of the Primarchs that if the Iron Warriors ever turned traitor, they would be the ones to breach Terra's walls. Dorn, impassive as always, had replied, "So long as my sons breathe, no wall we build shall fall to any hand." It was meant as an affirmation, a simple truth. But Perturabo, already wounded by countless perceived slights, took it as the deepest insult. There were no oaths exchanged, no formal declarations of hatred. But in that moment, what little kinship remained between the 4th and 7th Legions withered entirely. During the Horus Heresy, the rivalry turned from quiet hostility into open war. When Perturabo joined Horus in rebellion, he made certain that his legion would cross paths with Dorn's. It was the Iron Warriors who ambushed an Imperial Fists fleet at the Battle of Fall, a savage void engagement that left dozens of ships gutted and drifting, their crews turned to vapor in the cold darkness. Perturabo had arranged it like a chess move, baiting the Fists into overextending and then striking with brutal precision. Dorn was not present at Fall, but the message had been received. Later, as the siege of Terra began, Perturabo seized his chance to outdo his rival once and for all. It was the Iron Warriors who led the siege engines against the walls Dorn had raised. The trenches dug before the palace bore Perturabo's mark, as did the artillery patterns that cracked its foundations. It became a personal vendetta woven into the war, Every breach in the Emperor's walls was a wordless accusation thrown in Dorn's face. And though the traitor Primarch was eventually displaced by Horus's shifting strategies, the damage had been done. Dorn would never forget. Neither would Perturabo. In the aftermath of the heresy, as traitor legions scattered into the Eye of Terror, Perturabo retreated, not just in space but into obsession. He had not taken Terra, but he had wounded it, and that wound, to him, was victory enough. Yet still it gnawed at him. His genius had not been properly recognized. His hatred for Dorn was no longer just rivalry, it was ideology. So he built a monument to that hatred, the Eternal Fortress. It was not constructed as a bastion of survival or as a rallying point for his dwindling forces. It was not meant to endure against the coming wrath of the Imperium. It was bait, a dare, a symbol, a message meant for one man alone. On the surface, the Eternal Fortress seemed like an impregnable redoubt, unassailable by any conventional means. But it was more than that. It was a battlefield shaped like a riddle. Every trench, every bunker, every concealed artillery position had been calculated not for defense, but to grind down an attacker in the most humiliating and exhausting way possible. Perturabo didn't want Dorn to simply lose. He wanted Dorn to suffer. He wanted every breach to feel hollow, every gain to feel like defeat. And above it all loomed that final symbolic structure, a hollow citadel at the center of the maze, its ramparts sheer and adorned with false idols. It looked like the heart of the fortress, but it was nothing more than a lure, a phantom prize, a final insult. Dorn, when he learned of the fortress, did not hesitate. He understood the intent immediately. There were no illusions about what Perturabo had done. The trap was not subtle. It wasn't meant to be. It was a challenge. Dorn's name carved in the geometry of the battlefield itself. The other Primarchs advised caution. Gilliman, ever the strategist, urged restraint. He reminded Dorn that a single legion was not enough to storm a fortress designed by the master of siegecraft. He warned that the cost would be terrible, but Dorn could not ignore the provocation. The wound was too deep. This wasn't just war, it was reckoning. And so the path was set. The Iron Warriors had been the first to test Dorn's walls. Now Dorn would test theirs, and neither brother expected to emerge unchanged. There was no beauty in Sebastus IV, no verdant forests to burn, no noble cities to sack, no long-forgotten relics of mankind's golden age. It was a dead world, a sunless husk cloaked in ash storms and veined with veins of rust-colored stone. It should have been beneath notice, just another nameless corpse in a galaxy choking on war. And yet, here stood one of the greatest fortresses ever constructed in the age of men or gods. A creation so vast, so deliberate in its malice, that it could not have been born of anything but obsession. The Eternal Fortress. That was the name it would come to bear. It had others before, each one filtered through the terrified whispers of astartes and the last breaths of dying scouts. But Eternal was the one that endured. Not because it could not be destroyed, nothing in this galaxy was beyond ruin, but because it was designed to make death itself feel eternal. It was not just a stronghold, it was a crucible of suffering, a monument to hatred. Its architect was Perturabo. By the time he began its construction, the Iron Warriors had become something else entirely. The heresy had broken many things: trust, empires, families. But for the Sons of Olympia, it had stripped away everything but spite. They were no longer warriors in pursuit of unity or even survival. They were builders of death machines, engines of siege, avatars of slow destruction. Under Perturabo's command, they returned from the ashes of defeat, not humbled, but sharpened. And Perturabo himself, he had become a thing of cold fury, focused entirely on the annihilation of his brother Dorn. The Eternal Fortress was not a military necessity. It was not meant to hold ground, to defend a prize, or to buy time. It was theater, an elaborate living sculpture, a trap made to tempt one enemy, and only one, into its jaws. The Iron Warriors had always hated the Imperial Fists, but Perturabo needed Dorn to come. Every trench carved into the earth was a question, every bunker a dare, every gun emplacement a whisper. Come find me. And Dorn, in time, would answer. But before that could happen, the fortress had to be built, and Perturabo built like no other. The construction of the Eternal Fortress consumed months, possibly years. The timelines were never recorded, not in any form surviving Imperial intelligence. Time moved strangely for the traitor legions after the heresy, and the warp bled into real space like rot under a bandage. But however long it took, the result was horrifying in its detail. It spanned 20 square miles of planetary surface, ringed in overlapping trenches, kill zones, and artillery nests. Each layer was calculated, each approach engineered not simply to stall or repel, but to confuse, isolate, and annihilate. It had no singular wall, no clear perimeter, no weakness in the classic sense. The fortress was composed of layers upon layers, a fractal geometry of murder. Artillery emplacements were buried beneath seeming rubble. Bunkers disguised as ruins opened fire only once prey had passed beyond their firing arcs. Firing lines overlapped in maddening arcs, ensuring that retreat was punished as viciously as advance. Minefields were arranged in deceptive corridors, some armed, others inert, forcing invading forces to gamble with every step. Worst of all were the tunnels. Beneath the surface, the Iron Warriors had carved out an entire sub-fortress, not simply a basement or a storage facility, but a mirrored labyrinth that allowed them to move unseen. Here, kill teams could appear behind enemy lines as if summoned from the rock itself. Squads disappeared into these tunnels and were never seen again, dragged into the dark, butchered in echoing silence. Perturabo designed the fortress with no single center of command, no throne, no high tower, only the illusion of one. At the very heart of the structure stood a vast keep, its walls thicker than most hive cities, its silhouette jagged and brutal. But it was empty, a shell, a decoy. The true control of the battlefield lay diffused across hundreds of command points, allowing Perturabo to respond with flexibility and cruelty. If an enemy broke through to the heart of the fortress, they would find only silence and smoke. He even arranged for the sounds of combat to be deliberately manipulated, echoing booms of non-existent artillery, distant cries for help from voices no longer living. Vox frequencies jammed or hijacked, sensors blinded, navigators misled. The fortress did not simply resist intrusion, it unraveled the very senses of those who dared enter. The fortress was, by every metric, a masterwork, but it was also madness. Perturabo poured himself into its making, more than even his own sons realized. He became a ghost on Sebastus IV, appearing in the dead of night, inspecting trench angles, recalculating artillery arcs, sketching new death traps in the dust with his bare fingers. He did not sleep, did not eat. His armor was said to have fused to his flesh in places, his voice a rasp by the end. Even his gene sons spoke of him with unease during those days. He had always been distant, but now he was something else entirely. A mind consumed by geometry and vengeance. And in the final stages, the fortress began to change in ways even the Iron Warriors had not anticipated. Demon engines prowled its halls. Symbols not of man's making appeared on its walls. The geometry bent in subtle, impossible ways. Corners folded where no corners should exist. Time within the deeper bunkers stretched unnaturally. Servitors aged and died in minutes. What had begun as a fortress became something else. Perturabo denied no one access. Even the warp, it seemed, was permitted a place in his grand design. Was it desperation or ambition? Some say Perturabo sought to draw the attention of the gods who had uplifted his brothers to demonhood. Others say he cared nothing for ascension, only for creating a machine of pure retribution. Perhaps he didn't know what he wanted. Perhaps he simply wanted Dorn to see it, to walk its corridors, to feel its weight, to understand. He named it for its purpose, the Eternal Fortress. Eternal not because it would never fall, but because what happened within it would be remembered forever. Not just by the sons of Olympia or Terra, but by the galaxy itself. And then he waited. The Iron Warriors took up their positions like actors on a stage. Ammunition was stockpiled, kill zones were pre-sighted, defensive patterns rehearsed to perfection. Then silence fell over Sebastus IV. No distress signals, no threats, no boasts, only the quiet heartbeat of distant guns waiting to be fired. Dorn would come. Perturabo knew it. Every rivet, every stone, every blood-slicked bolt gun was a prayer to that certainty. And far away, deep in the void, the Praetorian received the message. He studied the schematics, calculated the risks, and then, without hesitation, gave the order to engage. The trap was ready, and soon, the cage would close. When the last of the traitor ships fled the Sol system, when the ruined ramparts of the Imperial Palace ceased to smoke, the true war began. Not of fire and gun, but of belief. For all its noise and horror, the Horus Heresy had left behind not unity, but uncertainty. The Emperor no longer walked. The Imperium had survived, but only barely. And in the vacuum left by the master of mankind's silence, his sons began to speak with louder voices. The loudest among them was Robute Guilliman. Where Dorn had withdrawn to his ships and his vengeance, Guilliman returned to his domain of Ultramar with quill and command staff in equal measure. He did not mourn as Dorn did. He rebuilt. He reorganized. To him, the failure of the heresy was systemic. An empire too centralized, a military too concentrated in the hands of a few, and a chain of command unable to adapt to betrayal from within. Horus had not just wounded the Imperium, he had exposed its vulnerability. Guilliman intended to cure it, and so came the Codex Astartes. It was not just a book, it was a decree, a manifesto, a new vision of what the adeptus astartes should be in the age after the heresy. No longer would legions, vast and unwieldy, march across the stars under the sole command of a Primarch. The Codex called for division. Each legion was to be broken into chapters, 1,000 warriors perforce, self-sufficient and tactically independent. Astartes would become scalpel strikes instead of sledgehammers. Control would pass not to one, but to many. In this, Guilliman saw salvation. In it, Dorn saw sacrilege. The moment the Codex reached the Imperial Fists aboard the Phalanx, a storm ignited. It was not the kind fought with bolters or blade, but one of pride and conviction. Dorn read it, word for word. Not once, not twice, but again and again. When he finished, he placed it down and said nothing for hours. To Guilliman, that silence was louder than any defiance. The Primarchs convened on Terra, not with cheers and banners, but in the shadow of the Emperor's throne, whose light was now flickering under the weight of the Golden Throne's slow decay. Guilliman spoke first, methodical and precise. He laid out the reasoning. The need for reform, the horror of another war master, the necessity of decentralization. Dorn listened, but his face, stony at the best of times, became unreadable. Then he spoke, and his voice was like the crack of a glacier breaking. No. The room froze. Dorn did not argue the Codex's logic. He rejected its premise entirely. The sons of Terra had bled, had died by the tens of thousands to defend the Imperium. The Imperial Fists had held the walls of the palace against gods and monsters, and now Guilliman expected them to disband? To fracture their unity because others had failed? Legions are not the problem, Dorn said. Betrayal is. There was no shouting, no insults, only words made heavy by legacy. Guilliman did not call Dorn a traitor, but the implication hung in the air. He said that defying the Codex meant placing the will of a single warrior above the survival of the Imperium. Dorn, ever the embodiment of duty, recoiled at that. How could his loyalty be questioned when his legion had been the shield of humanity? But Guilliman had no room for sentiment. He reminded Dorn that the next War Master would not be Horus. It could be anyone. It could be Dorn himself. The insult landed, not just on Dorn, but on his sons. The Imperial Fists returned to the phalanx in silence. They did not engage in further debate. They prepared for war. It is said in the archives of the Inquisition that the Imperium teetered on the edge of a second civil war in those days, a war not of heresy, but of vision. Dorn was not alone. Leman Russ, always the wild blade of the Emperor, bristled at the idea of bureaucrats telling him how to wield his sons. Vulcan grieved too deeply to speak much, but what little he said echoed Dorn's words. Even Corax, though quieter, questioned the need to strip identity from warriors who had earned every scar. But Guilliman's influence spread like ink through parchment. The Ultramarines, vast and organized, had already begun the transition. Their successors were forming with efficiency unmatched. Fleet by fleet, chapter by chapter, the Codex's will began reshaping the astartes. The pressure mounted. Political, ideological, even spiritual. Dorn faced a choice: yield and divide his legion, or stand firm and risk being branded a traitor by the very Imperium he had given everything to defend. So he chose a third path. He would test them. He would not reject the Codex outright, nor would he embrace it blindly. If his sons were to be broken into chapters, they would first endure a crucible, something so profound, so defining, that no one could question their loyalty, their strength, or their right to carry their legacy into the new age. They would suffer as only the sons of Dorn could. They would prove themselves one final time, and if they failed, then perhaps the Codex deserved to be followed after all. Dorn never explained his full plan to his captains. He did not convene councils or gather votes. He simply began readying the Legion for war. Sebastus IV had come to his attention. Reports whispered of a fortress that defied the void itself, the signature of Iron Warrior's fortification patterns, the breathless testimony of a dead scout's final Vox transmission. Perturabo's name was not mentioned. It didn't need to be. Dorn knew, and he knew that Perturabo had built it for him, and so, in a decision that would define the Imperial Fists forever, Dorn declared his purpose. They would assault the fortress. All of them, the entire 7th Legion. Not because it made tactical sense, not because it was part of a broader strategy, but because it was the perfect test. No reinforcements, no support from other legions, no political cover. They would break the enemy's will or break upon it, and in the doing they would either prove the necessity of unity or the necessity of the Codex. It was a cruel gamble. Some whispered that Dorn had finally cracked under the weight of loss. Others said he was too proud to admit Guilliman had a point. But among the Fists, there was no question. Their Primarch had spoken, and where Dorn led, they would follow. They gathered in silence, thousands of battle brothers clad in burnished yellow, veterans of the siege, survivors of 1,000 battlefields. They boarded their ships without ceremony. There was no parade, no last words. Only one phrase passed between squads as they locked their bolters and checked their armor seals. This is how we end. and in the stars above Sebastus IV, the phalanx cast its vast shadow across the void, its engines screaming with the fury of oath-bound vengeance. The trial had begun, and the cage waited. There are battlefields that are chosen out of necessity, natural choke points, vital resources, tactical advantages. Sebastus IV was none of those. It was a wasteland, a planet scoured by radiation storms and crusted with iron oxide, its skies forever choked in roiling clouds. Nothing grew there, nothing lived. And yet, from orbit, the world pulsed like a dying star with malicious intent. The patterns of its fortifications were visible even from space, unnatural, rigid, methodical, like veins of poison etched across its surface. To most, it would have been a warning. To Rogal Dorn, it was a summons. The moment he saw the schematics, captured grainy and fragmented from scout reports, he understood exactly what he was looking at. The angles were too precise, the trenches too deliberate, the bunkers placed in a fashion no conventional military engineer would consider. The whole of it was not simply a defense, it was an invitation, an insult cast in stone and steel. Only one mind in the galaxy could have built it. Only one brother would think to create something so grotesquely perfect. Perturabo. He didn't sign his name to the Eternal Fortress, he didn't have to. It was as unmistakable as a slap across the face. Dorn could almost feel the sneer behind every killing field, every overlapping arc of fire, every false approach. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a message written in geometry and blood. And it said, "I'm waiting." Dorn did not hesitate. He called his captains to war. The 7th Legion, still unbroken from the Great Crusade and the heresy that followed, was arrayed for battle once more. From orbit, the phalanx, the mighty star fortress of the Imperial Fists, eclipsed the surface of Sebastus IV. Gunships, strike cruisers, and Thunderhawk carriers peeled off from its sides like wasps from a hive. The preparations were immediate and absolute. There was no time for diplomacy, for reconnaissance, for coalition. Dorn was not coming to consider options. He was coming to bury his brother in his own monument. Yet, beneath the silence of his orders, behind the iron discipline of his legion, something darker stirred. The Fists knew this was not just another battle. There was no strategic value to the world, no high command directive. No aid from the other legions would be called. There was only the fortress and the will to face it. The truth spread in the quiet spaces between orders. This was the end. Some whispered that Dorn intended this to be a final test of the legion's worth, a crucible by which they would be judged. Others believed he meant to die there, to bring Perturabo low, even at the cost of everything else. The Legion had suffered before. On the walls of Terra, they had stared into the eyes of gods and held firm. But this was different. They weren't defending humanity's throne. They were walking willingly into a grave. And still none hesitated. The Sons of Dorn had been forged to endure. That was their curse and their glory. Pain was irrelevant. Loss was expected. The enemy was in the walls, and their Primarch had pointed to the breach. They would go. Dorn gave no speeches. He did not pace the decks of the phalanx, did not offer comfort or justification. He stood in his strategium, staring at the spinning wireframe of the fortress, watching it rotate slowly like a puzzle cube with razor blades for edges. He said only this to his commanders: "I will bring him back in an iron cage." Simple, blunt, inevitable. And so the iron cage received its name, not from those who built it, but from the one it was meant to trap. The invasion began with fire. Orbital bombardments lit up the atmosphere, shells slamming into the upper crust of Sebastus IV with continent-rending force. Plasma flares traced the horizon as lance batteries dug trenches into the surface from orbit. The phalanx loomed above, its broadside cannons pumping energy into the night with terrifying rhythm. But the fortress did not break. From their emplacements, the Iron Warriors did not return fire. They watched, measured, calculated. The silence was deafening. It wasn't cowardice, it wasn't even tactical delay. It was confidence. Perturabo didn't need to fire first. He had built his masterpiece. His prey had arrived. All he had to do was wait for them to come closer. And Dorn obliged him. Drop pods screamed down like meteors. Thunderhawks cut through radioactive winds. Hundreds, thousands of Imperial Fists descended toward the surface, clad in their sunburst yellow armor, their bolters locked and loaded, formation perfect. They struck the ground and spread, forming an unbreakable spearhead. Their goal: push through the outer defenses, find the heart of the fortress, and kill whatever waited inside. But the Iron Warriors had planned for that too. The moment the boots of the first tactical squad crunched down on Sebastus IV's soil, the trap began to close. Hidden macro cannon arrays buried deep beneath the surface, activated with a mechanical shriek. Tracer fire stitched through the darkness. Anti-air emplacements that had remained silent during bombardment now erupted with hellish fury, targeting dropships and thunderhawks with devastating precision. Entire squads were obliterated mid-descent, torn apart before they ever reached the trenches. But even that was not the true horror, because this wasn't a fortress designed to repel an enemy. It was a fortress designed to consume one. The minefields were laid in unpredictable patterns, triggered not by proximity, but by weight thresholds, by sound, by movement speed. Automated servitor turrets rotated in irregular intervals, denying any safe approach. Bunkers fired at retreating squads, not advancing ones. Vox signals were distorted, rerouted, confused. And the deeper they pressed, the worse it became. Trenches, seemingly abandoned, would erupt with flamer fire from hidden alcoves. Lanes of movement that appeared clear collapsed into pits of sharpened rebar and seismic charges. Whole units vanished into the ground as collapsing tunnels and false corridors swallowed them. Dorn pressed forward without pause. Each setback was met with new deployment, each casualty with relentless push. The Fists adapted, adjusted, absorbed the losses. Every soldier knew the price of this mission. They had not come expecting rescue. They had come to kill a ghost. And that ghost watched. Perturabo, hidden deep within the fortress in chambers only he could navigate, observed everything through relays and lenses. His voice echoed through Vox ghosts across the field, taunting, cold, emotionless. "You've come far, brother," he said once, his voice filtering into Dorn's command channel, scrambled and distorted. "But all roads in this place lead back to me, just not the way you expect." Dorn did not respond. He silenced the channel. There would be no war of words, no psychological ploy. Let the enemy build his fortress of illusions. The Sons of Terra would meet them with steel. Still, even the stoicism of the Imperial Fists could not deny what was happening. This was not a conventional war, not even a siege. It was an execution, and they were walking into it willingly. Yet none turned back, because if this was their final hour, then they would make it a monument. They would bleed upon every wall, mark every trench with fire and sacrifice. The enemy thought to humiliate them, to break them. Instead, they would become legend. So the Fists pushed on, into the cage, into the silence, into the jaws of the beast that bore their brother's name. There were no horns to sound the advance, no banners raised against the wind. When the Imperial Fists breached the outer perimeter of the Eternal Fortress, they did so without pageantry or pause. They were not warriors seeking glory. They were tools of a will greater than themselves. They were the fists of vengeance, clenched and silent. The outer defenses had been a blood baptism. The landing zones were cratered tombs. The skies, once filled with the thunder of drop pods and gunships, were now charred and thick with ash. But the fists endured. They always endured. What they had faced so far was nothing compared to what lay beyond. The outer ring of the fortress, layered in trenchworks, gun nests, and collapsing kill boxes, had not been designed to stop an army. It had been built to sift it, to strain the strong from the weak. By the time the first companies pushed beyond those lethal boundaries, they were already diminished. Their ranks bled of the untested and the unwary. Dorn had known this would happen. He had counted on it. What was left now was his iron core, hardened, blood-slick, unafraid. What awaited them beyond those lines was not a war zone. It was a maze. There were no clear streets, no straight corridors. The Eternal Fortress was not a castle, it was a labyrinth. Twisting trenches wrapped around sunken pits, bunkers connected to sealed tunnels that ran for miles, only to end in dead space. Machine spires jutted from the earth like broken bones, their purposes unknowable, their humming voices speaking in binary tongues no longer sane. Paths looped back on themselves, only to shift in the dark. Time lost meaning inside. Some squads reported that hours passed between movements. Others claimed they'd covered a kilometer in what felt like minutes. Gravity pulled strangely in some sectors. Vox signals drifted or repeated themselves hours later like echoes through time. A scout squad, separated briefly in a sudden storm of sand and static, was found a day later. Every member aged to near death, hair white, voices hoarse with unspeakable mutterings. Their armor was still fresh with paint. Their chrono logs had recorded less than 10 minutes. Perturabo had turned the warp itself into a weapon. The Imperial Fists advanced anyway. They mapped what they could, dropped locator beacons, left coded marks carved into stone and ferrocrete. Every corridor was measured, every shadow studied, every pattern dissected. They made sense of madness, not through intuition or psychic gift, but with stubborn, grinding effort. They were the Emperor's masons as much as his marines. Where the Iron Warriors had built, they would unbuild. But the deeper they moved, the fewer answers they found. The maze was alive, not in the sense of movement or breath, not overtly, but it shifted in ways no structure should. Walls that had been intact 1 hour would be rubble the next. Pathways collapsed behind them without sound. Entire sections disappeared from maps, swallowed not by demolition but by absence. Beacons vanished. Return paths sealed themselves behind layers of iron as thick as city walls. And all the while, the Iron Warriors watched. Rarely did they engage directly. They did not meet the fists in glorious lines. They did not charge. They harassed. They disappeared. A sniper's bolt would crack through the air, claiming a sergeant, and then silence. Mines triggered in empty corridors. Dreadnoughts emerged from bunkers, rained fire, and withdrew before retaliation. The attacks weren't meant to kill. They were meant to disorient, to bleed, to humiliate. In one section, a squad of fists breached a fortified node, only to find the Iron Warriors had already evacuated, leaving behind nothing but a wall carved with crude shapes, mocking images of Dorn impaled upon his own sigil. Another group encountered servitors fused into the walls, their flesh stretched and wired into the structure, their voices wailing Dorn's name in broken binary. It was not war, it was theater, a stage upon which the Iron Warriors acted out their revenge. But the Imperial Fists were not made of men who buckled. With every ambush, they adapted. With every collapse, they recalculated. Company by company, they advanced into the heart of the nightmare, refusing to be cowed. They moved in silence. They conserved ammunition. They shared rations. They mapped everything. And slowly, something began to change. The maze grew quieter. The ambushes rarer. Resistance faded. Some believed they had turned the tide. that the fortress was bleeding out its defenders, unable to match the relentless fury of Dorn's legion. Some believed they were winning. They were wrong. Perturabo had never meant to keep them out. He had always intended to let them in, somewhere deep in the fortress where no light reached and gravity coiled in unfamiliar directions. A console lit up. A data construct bound to no machine the Mechanicus would recognize flickered into activity. Perturabo watched through 1,000 eyes. The Imperial Fists were inside. Now the real war would begin. He gave no commands to attack, not yet. He adjusted flow patterns, rerouted power to pressure seals, reconfigured corridor paths, opened fuel lines beneath their advance routes. He whispered to the walls, and they listened. His fortress was not a static entity. It was an organism, a puzzle box, a weapon of perfect cruelty. They had reached the core of the maze. They just didn't know it yet. Perturabo leaned back from the control throne and studied the data streams as they flowed. Ammunition counts, positioning reports, Vox intercepts, physiological strain levels. Then he spoke to no one in particular. Let them think they've won. Back above the surface, Dorn stood among the command elements at the forward firebase, a circle of scorched ground and makeshift bastions, dug and built with the speed only the 7th Legion could manage. His armor was darkened with ash. Storm's teeth, his massive chainsword, was chipped. His gauntlets bore blood not his own. He did not rest. His commanders came and went, reporting casualties, requesting reinforcements. Dorn gave orders without hesitation, each one precise. His eyes never left the data feed. The fortress was ahead, its central citadel looming like a silent god, dark and unmoving. He could feel Perturabo's hand behind every shifting wall, every vanishing corridor. This was not a battlefield, it was a mind, one shaped in iron and spite. And he would break it, not with speed, not with cleverness, but with will. He knew they were being drawn in, knew every step forward was one deeper into the jaws of something monstrous. He did not care. If Perturabo thought the maze would consume him, he had forgotten who Dorn was. Walls had never been his prison. They had been his purpose. And now he would tear this one down from within, stone by stone, room by room, brother by brother, if he had to. Because this was not just a war of strength. It was a war of endurance. And Dorn did not break. He never had. The sky broke first, high above Sebastus IV's scorched surface, where the stars had once gleamed like distant promises. Darkness churned into war. The Imperial Fists fleet had not remained idle while Dorn waged his battle within the bowels of the Eternal Fortress. Orbit was theirs, or so they believed. They had brought strength to this battle, strike cruisers, escort frigates, the phalanx itself looming like a great titan of steel and wrath, a force mighty enough to glass continents. But Perturabo had planned not just for trenches and mines. He had planned for the void. It began with a ripple in the auspex. One moment, the skies above the planet were clear. The next, they screamed. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of warp signatures flared into existence at the system's edge. Ships bearing the livery of rust and gunmetal, marked with the eye of Horus and the jagged insignia of the 4th Legion, erupted from the void with weapons primed and formations already aligned. These were not ragged traitor remnants. They were a fleet honed for ambush, and they struck with surgical fury. The Iron Warriors had returned, not as defenders, as predators. Aboard the phalanx, alarms howled through cathedral-length corridors. Bridge crews, battle-hardened veterans of the heresy itself, shouted over rising Vox chatter. Captain Helbras of the 3rd Battle Group snapped orders as decks trembled beneath lance impacts. Weapons free. Target their drive clusters. No quarter. The fleet responded as trained, engines flaring, void shields roaring to life. Plasma batteries and macro cannons answered the challenge, lashing out with apocalyptic force. In the void, there is no cover, no high ground. There is only who strikes first, and who endures the longest. And the Iron Warriors had struck first. Their ships swarmed like a murder of crows, destroyers bristling with torpedoes curved under the Imperial Fists formations, targeting weak spots. Boarding vessels drove forward, bellies bristling with claws and breach drills. They didn't just want to cripple the fleet, they wanted to get inside it. They wanted to break the Imperial Fists from the top down. The Phalanx alone was holding its own. The great fortress ship was ancient, a relic of the Great Crusade, armed with weapons no Forge world dared replicate. Whole squadrons of enemy vessels vanished beneath its broadside barrages, but even it could not shield the entire fleet. One by one, isolated strike cruisers were surrounded, overwhelmed, cut off from Vox contact. Some vanished in bursts of light. Others were left drifting, their engines dead and hulls vented. But worse than the destruction was the silence, because in the chaos of battle, the Iron Warriors unleashed their true weapon, disruption, jamming signals, severing communications, deploying automated interference drones that flooded Vox frequencies with gibbering echoes and false commands. Within minutes, command structures across the Imperial Fists fleet fractured, orders delayed, reports lost, tactical cohesion unraveled like cloth in flame. Then came the boarding parties. The 22nd Company's strike cruiser, Unyielding Will, went dark at 0325 local system time. When a support vessel made contact again 20 minutes later, the only transmission received was a single phrase, repeated over and over in a static, choked voice. They're inside. The Iron Warriors had breached the hull, not through the main hangars nor through obvious points of assault. They tunneled, literally. Using plasma drills and boarding claws, they dug into blind spots, non-critical areas never meant to face combat. They carved their way through ducts, fuel lines, subdecks. When the first alarm sounded, the 22nd was already under siege. They came not as screaming berserkers or howling demons, but with cold, mechanical efficiency. Breach teams with melta cutters, combat servitors stripped to the bone, siege tyrants in exo armor, hammering down corridors like mobile cathedrals. Their assault was less a fight and more an execution. They had one purpose: kill the command staff, sever the head, cripple the fleet from within. In chamber after chamber, the Imperial Fists made their last stands. Marines fought in flickering corridors, their bolters thundering at point-blank range. Servo hatches sealed behind them, trapping invaders in kill zones. Chapters of the Codex Astartes were enacted in real time, boarding countermeasures drilled into every Space Marine from the day of their creation. But the Iron Warriors knew these tactics. They had written countermeasures of their own. Back on the surface, the battle within the fortress raged on, but the skies above had changed. Vox links once relayed from the fleet above now stuttered with static. Artillery coordination faltered. Supply drops failed to arrive. Dorn's commanders tried to hail orbit, but the answers came warped, if at all. Only fragments. Fleet under assault. Unknown losses. They're coming down. And then, silence. Dorn did not flinch. When his communications officer turned, face pale, and said, "My lord, we've lost the fleet," Dorn simply replied, "Then the cage has shut." It was true. Perturabo's plan had never been to destroy Dorn's fleet in orbit. Not entirely. It was enough to cripple it. To sever the Legion's access to support, to evacuation, to the stars themselves. The Iron Cage was not just the fortress, it was the world. Sebastus IV had become a prison. Every one of Dorn's warriors planetside was now trapped. There would be no retreat, no resupply, no cavalry waiting beyond the clouds. The Imperial Fists were alone. Some of Dorn's senior captains urged fallback, not retreat, for that was not in the 7th Legion's vocabulary, but consolidation. Find defensible positions, hold what ground they could, wait for an opening. Dorn refused. He saw the trap. He had always seen it, and he had chosen to walk into it anyway, because if this was a prison, he would become the executioner. He ordered the advance to continue. Every squad, every company. No pause, no hesitation. The fortress would fall, or they would. And so into the silence of the fortress, beneath the broken sky, the sons of Terra marched on. Not because they believed they would win, but because their Primarch had not turned back. Because even if their fleet was shattered, even if the heavens burned, even if the sky itself fell, so long as Dorn stood, the wall had not broken. And they would rather die behind their wall than live without it. In the control vaults of the Eternal Fortress, Perturabo watched the skies burn. He saw the phalanx holding back the tide, saw boarding actions unfold, saw signal disruption, sever link after link. He measured casualties in percentages. He calculated hours until orbital superiority was his. He did not smile. There was no glee, only satisfaction. The trap had worked. Dorn was in the cage. Now, the bleeding could begin. They called it a fortress. That was the lie. The truth was far crueler. A fortress protects. A fortress shelters. The Eternal Fortress did neither. It consumed. It devoured. It was not a structure built to hold the line, but to erase the very concept of one. With every meter the Imperial Fists advanced, it revealed itself more as a butcher's maze than a bastion. And now, with the sky above them severed and their fleet reeling in orbital chaos, the Sons of Dorn were left with only one direction: forward, forward into hell. It began with silence. The initial fury, the thunder of bombardment, the screaming descent of drop pods, the staccato rhythm of bolter fire had faded, not because the battle had ended, but because it had changed. Gone was the open conflict of landing zones and shock assaults. Now came the attrition, the slow grind, the war measured not in victories, but in the inches of blood-soaked trench, gained at unbearable cost. The fortress did not fight like an army. It fought like a disease. Whole corridors seemed to breathe. Trapdoors appeared where none had existed hours before. Pressure sensors activated deadfall gates, slicing astartes in half with adamantium shutters. Ammunition stockpiles, secured and marked, were rigged to detonate the moment they were opened. Thermal scans showed nothing. Auspex readings were blind. No more sniper nests, no more frontal charges. Now it was slow poisoning, asphyxiation by design. Psychological warfare not through propaganda, but through erosion. A squad might move through an entire trench complex without resistance, only to discover every exit collapsed behind them, sealed in with nothing but darkness and the low hiss of venting gas. Another squad might breach a bunker after hours of firefight, only to find a dead end filled with nothing but piles of rusted Imperial Fist helmets, placed neatly in rows, each one a silent accusation. Then the screaming began. Not from the Fists, never from them, but from the fortress itself. Vox channels lit up with garbled transmissions, fragments of old messages from fallen battle brothers, voices half familiar warped into madness. Pull back. No, no, we hold. Dorn, I see them. I see them in the walls. We never left Istvan. All lies, all carefully orchestrated. Perturabo was not just watching. He was speaking. He understood his brother in the way only enemies can. He knew Dorn would not break from pain, from loss, from tactical failure. But confusion, doubt, the slow unraveling of order, that was the chisel. Not a hammer against the shield, but water dripping on stone until it cracked. But even as the trap deepened, even as the walls closed, the Imperial Fists refused to shatter. They responded as they always had, with method and discipline. A lesser legion might have panicked, might have turned in on itself, accused the fortress of sorcery, sought shelter in superstition. But the Fists endured. They mapped every corridor they crossed, even when the maps failed. They tallied their dead with reverence. Every fallen brother was noted, remembered, and left only when no recovery was possible. They sealed off compromised sectors with their own explosives. They scavenged Iron Warrior munitions and repurposed them. Where a tunnel collapsed, they dug another. Dorn had trained them for this. Not for this fortress specifically, but for hopelessness. For the inevitability of being outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and pressing forward regardless. He did not promise survival, only purpose. And so the battle became a ritual, not a charge, a carving. Day after day, through shifting corridors and grinding steel, the Imperial Fists cut through Perturabo's masterpiece with the patience of a surgeon. Where the Iron Warriors had crafted clever traps, the Fists disarmed them with brutal directness. Where bunkers fell silent, they were breached and torched. Where trenches twisted into madness, the Fists laid down directional guides, marking paths with sacred sigils only they could read. They refused to be lost. Even when squads vanished, lost in the endless tunnels, their life signs gone dark, Dorn refused to halt the advance. He did not grieve. He did not rage. He pressed onward. Because the fortress wanted a reaction, it fed on disarray, on fear, on grief, and Dorn gave it none. Instead, he gave it attrition. By the 10th day, the casualty lists had grown long. Entire companies were operating at half strength. Medicae supplies were dwindling, communications were still fragmented, ammunition reserves were dangerously low. And still the Imperial Fists advanced. They did not ask for rescue. They did not expect it. Instead, they began to turn the fortress against itself. It was Dorn's strategy, though none dared call it such. Where the Iron Warriors had built walls, the Fists breached them, not to pass through, but to reroute fire lanes. Where automated turrets emerged, they captured and reprogrammed them. Bunkers became makeshift rally points. Power cores were located, tapped, and siphoned to rearm plasma weapons. Even the enemy dead were not wasted, their equipment stripped, examined, recorded. There was no waste. There was only purpose. But even as they adapted, the fortress responded in kind. The attacks became more brutal. The Iron Warriors, once elusive, now engaged in sudden ambushes, hit and fade assaults meant to bleed and vanish. Terminators emerged from hidden lifts, their chain fists screaming through the dark. Obliterators, twisted fusions of man and weapon, crawled from power nodes, spraying death in all directions. The deeper the Fists pressed, the more Perturabo revealed the depths of his arsenal, and the labyrinth grew worse. Gravity began to fail in places. Squads found themselves drifting in sealed compartments, unable to orient. Time dilation warped perception. Battle brothers would blink, and hours passed. One squad claimed to have fought the same Iron Warrior for 3 days, never eating, never sleeping, in a single stretch of corridor that looped in on itself. Some began to murmur of demons. Others, those who had fought on Terra, who had seen worse, dismissed the fear. "It's not chaos," said one sergeant as he patched a hole in his armor with scavenged ceramite. "It's Perturabo. That's worse." Still, they held. Rogal Dorn did not sleep. He moved from position to position, bleeding with his sons, never resting, never pausing. Where a breach was threatened, he arrived. Where morale flagged, his presence lifted it. He said little. He did not need to. His presence was the shield. His will was the mortar. Every Imperial Fist on Sebastus IV understood. If they broke, they would be erased. not just from the world, but from history. Perturabo had built this fortress to be their tomb, but Dorn had come to turn that tomb into a legend. He was not here to survive, he was here to endure. And endurance, he taught his sons, was its own victory. Somewhere, deep beneath the shifting stone, Perturabo watched the casualty reports. He saw his ambushes fail. He saw his traps disarmed. He saw, with growing agitation, that Dorn had not come to be humiliated. He had come to destroy. The Lord of Iron did not rage, but he did begin to make adjustments. The maze would bleed the Imperial Fists, but now it would do so with greater precision. The fortress began to change, again. By the 12th day, the ground no longer slept. The Eternal Fortress, once a monument of steel and stone, became something else, something alive. Its halls had always been treacherous, its defenses cruel, but now it began to behave less like a structure and more like a mind. Cold, calculating, evolving. What had once been traps of iron became traps of intention. The fortress no longer waited to be assaulted. It reached. The Imperial Fists, pushing ever deeper into its rust-veined arteries, were the infection. And Perturabo, ever the dutiful surgeon, had decided it was time to excise the wound. It began subtly. Structural anomalies began appearing in locations already cleared. Bunkers secured and logged by Imperial cartographers shifted. Hallways that once led north now doubled back south. Recon drones sent into cleared zones vanished without transmission. Automated sentries previously disarmed began firing again. Only this time they didn't fire on the Fists. They ignored them. They waited, observed, adapted. Then the lights changed. Low-lit corridors, once burning with cold lumen glow, dimmed to a pulsing crimson. It was not a technical failure. It was a choice. The fortress wanted them to see it bleed. Shadows deepened, not from darkness, but from the bending of geometry itself. Angles twisted subtly. Vox frequencies became distorted with rhythmic pulses. Some claimed it was the beating of a heart. Others thought it was breathing. One veteran sergeant, a Terran-born warrior who had fought at the Eternity Wall during the Siege of Terra, muttered only once as he surveyed the new shifts. "We are walking through his skull." Because Perturabo was no longer content to merely observe, he was intervening. The first sign came in the form of silence. A forward recon squad, 10 astartes under Captain Varnor, had been tasked with pushing into Sector Omega 11, a labyrinth of collapsed infrastructure and power cores. Contact was lost 17 minutes after entry. Standard procedure was to wait. Fists do not panic. They confirm. But no return signal ever came. No distress beacon. No Vox hiss. Nothing. A recovery team was dispatched. What they found was not a battlefield. It was a display. 9 of the 10 missing Marines had been arranged in a circle, each standing upright, bolted into the floor through the knees. Their armor had been flayed open with plasma cutters. Their gene seed had been surgically extracted and placed in neat piles beside each corpse. Their bolters were intact, fully loaded and laid at their feet. The 10th Marine was not there, but his helmet was, placed neatly on a pedestal of iron. Inside was a recording. Captain Varnor's voice, calm, flat, monotone. He knows our patterns. He's watching us, watching him. This isn't war, it's art, and we are the pigment. The fortress had become more than a trap. It had become a message. Far behind the lines in the makeshift command hub buried in a collapsed bastion, Rogal Dorn stood over a hololithic representation of the fortress. What had once been static, lines, corridors, waypoints, was now in flux. The map no longer obeyed standard topography. Paths once cleared became errors. The system began redrawing itself in real time, responding to phantom movement and impossible feedback. Dorn didn't blink. He's changing the battlefield. A tech marine looked up from his console. "The internal architecture is fluid, my lord. Not just physically, mechanically, spiritually. There are markers of non-Euclidean curvature, and some of our servo skulls have reported visual echoes." Echoes? They see us walking through corridors before we've entered them. The Primarch said nothing. He turned back to the projection, eyes narrowed. Perturabo was not content to let the fortress remain passive. He was actively reshaping it, reconfiguring it in response to Dorn's every move. Dorn had studied siege warfare all his life. He had fought wars where enemies shifted tactics, rearranged lines, repositioned assets. But never had he fought a fortress that changed its own anatomy. And still, he refused to stop. "Continue the advance," he ordered. "But my lord," said Captain Etain, a veteran of the Iron Cage's earliest days, "if we cannot map it, we cannot coordinate. We're fighting ghosts in a maze that rewrites itself. What are we advancing toward?" "Truth," Dorn said. "His truth." The command chamber fell silent, because they all understood. This wasn't about defeating the Iron Warriors. It was about dragging Perturabo into the light, whatever it took. The next stage of the fortress's transformation was not subtle. The Earth itself began to shift. Massive tectonic movements were triggered beneath the fortress, not natural ones, engineered. Vast compression plates buried deep under the planet's crust began to tilt. The landscape responded like a wounded beast. Whole corridors split in two. Trenches collapsed. Artillery pits, once silent, detonated inward, swallowing companies whole. Runes buried under decades of iron dirt flared with light. Sorcerous engines, no doubt gifted by the Dark Mechanicum, now activated by the Lord of Iron's command. Astartes were not new to strange weapons. They had faced demons, warp beasts, cursed blades, and soul-drinking plagues. But this was something else. This was logic turned inside out. The fortress was beginning to ignore the rules of physics. Entire squads vanished from the top levels, only to reappear 20 meters below, buried alive in stone. Meltaguns ceased to ignite. Promethium burned blue instead of orange. Time itself flickered. Squadrons reported gaps in memory, blackouts, sudden jumps in positional data. And through it all, the Iron Warriors attacked. Not to kill, but to herd. Assaults came at the flanks, pushing fists into preordained routes. Mines were tripped not to detonate, but to redirect. Doors closed at just the right moment to isolate squads from one another. Perturabo was no longer reacting. He was sculpting. Every movement of the fists was part of a larger pattern, and only Dorn could see the shape of it. He knew what was happening. He was being drawn in, deliberately, meticulously, to a center he could not yet see. And still the Imperial Fists fought. They fought through hallucinations, through corridors of reversed gravity, through screaming walls and whispering vox static that carried voices of the long dead. They fought through demonic echoes and echoing wounds. They fought because Rogal Dorn was still standing, even as his sons were carved down by siege tyrants, buried beneath collapsing ceilings, lost in time-warped voids. They followed the golden ghost of their Primarch through the dark. Dorn gave no speeches. He did not comfort. He led. Sword in hand, helmet sealed, his armor battered and cracked, Dorn stood at the head of his dwindling legion and carved a path through the madness. He understood now. Perturabo didn't want to defeat him. He wanted to break him. To prove that the fortress, the symbol of everything Dorn had ever built, everything he had been, could be turned against him. That endurance was weakness. That order was a lie. That nothing in the end was truly unbreakable. Dorn smiled, not from amusement, but from recognition. Because in that moment he knew something his brother did not. Fortresses did not endure because of walls. They endured because of those who chose to defend them. And Rogal Dorn had made his choice. The fortress might shift, the fortress might bleed, the fortress might awaken, but it would not stop him. Nothing would. Deep within the warped labyrinth of Sebastus IV, time lost its grip. Days had passed. How many? No one could say with certainty. Hours melted together like metal under a forge. The chronometers worn by the Imperial Fists ran inconsistent, some ahead, others behind. No two devices agreed. Some astartes had stopped checking altogether. They knew what day it was, in the way only warriors in the dark know, the day they had not yet died. The Eternal Fortress no longer resembled a military installation. It had become a wound in reality, a wound with a pulse, and it throbbed around them. The architecture shifted, subtly but constantly. Bulkheads that had once stood firm buckled under unseen pressure. Floors bent upward as if pushed from beneath by something breathing. Walls moved an inch at a time when no one was looking. What had begun as a marvel of siegecraft had become something else, a living thing with malice carved into its bones. The fortress was no longer content to kill. It wanted to haunt. It wanted to unmake the soul of its enemy. Squad Jaster, 43 hours removed from their last known position, had stopped trusting their helmets. The autosenses showed them corridors they couldn't physically enter. Motion trackers registered non-existent presences behind walls. At one point, a pick feed displayed a full platoon of Imperial Fists approaching from a parallel hallway, except it was their own reflection, mimicking their every move half a second too late. They turned to investigate. There was no hallway. Then the whispers started. Not human, not machine. The Vox hissed, always just at the edge of audibility. Single words, sometimes names, often laughter. One of the newer initiates claimed to hear his mother's voice. Another swore he saw his homeworld, Pharos, on the other side of a reinforced viewport. But Pharos had been dead for 2 centuries. He tried to breach the window. They buried what was left of him beneath the collapsed stairwell and kept moving. In another sector, designated Gamma 7 by the dwindling command staff, a larger force of fists attempted to establish a rally point, a defensible staging ground. It was standard doctrine. Even in chaos, Dorn's sons obeyed structure. They reinforced the existing Pharaohcrete walls, rerouted power from a downed generator, and sealed 2 of the access tunnels with demolition charges. It held for 3 hours. Then, without warning, the walls groaned. Not from impact, not from breach. They wept. Actual moisture, thick and black, oozed from the seams in the walls. The ground rippled underfoot like a stretched membrane. One of the tech marines screamed, a rarity among astartes. When others turned, they found him half submerged in the floor, as though the stone had liquefied beneath him. His body twisted as it sank, armor buckling inward, ribs imploding. By the time they reached him, only his helmet remained. The eye lenses glowed, then went dark. They detonated the fallback point themselves and retreated, leaving behind no trace. They knew better than to hold ground against ghosts. Far below, deeper than even the Iron Warriors had dared excavate during the construction, there were corridors never meant to be reached. They were not tactical, not strategic, not functional. They were messages. Dorn himself walked there now, alone save for 2 veteran bodyguards, his path lit only by the crackling blue fire of his warplate. He had been following the pattern for hours, following the rhythm that only he could perceive. It was not a pattern of logic, or of geometry, or even of military thinking. It was a pattern of madness, but it was his brother's madness. And Dorn had always understood Perturabo better than Perturabo ever understood him. The corridor before him curved in impossible ways. The stone was carved with runes, some Olympian in origin, others older, cruder, possibly demonic. It was unclear. The walls bled sparks, Floor tiles were etched with fractal designs that shifted when not observed directly. More than once, Dorn found himself walking in loops. Same hall, same bloodstain, same broken iron warrior helm, but from different angles. His bodyguards began to falter. One removed his helmet. A mistake. He looked up. His eyes widened. He screamed a name no one recognized, fired 3 shots from his bolt pistol into a blank wall, and then, weeping, drove a combat knife through his throat. Dorn said nothing. The other remained silent. They walked on. The fortress was no longer trying to kill Dorn. It was trying to talk to him. The signs were everywhere now, shapes arranged in precise patterns, the number 4 repeating endlessly, as if in a whisper. At the end of one hallway, he found a pictograph etched into the stone, a child's crude drawing of 2 figures, one tall and armored holding a hammer, the other, smaller, building a wall. Above them, a crude star. Dorn stared at it for a long time. Perturabo had left this for him, not out of nostalgia, out of spite. He wanted Dorn to see what he had become, or what he believed Dorn had always been. The fortress whispered again, through dust, through vibrations, through memory. You made me this way. You were always the favorite. You were chosen to build while I was sent to destroy. Your walls were monuments, mine were tombs. Dorn did not argue. He did not rage. He simply pressed his armored gauntlet to the wall and kept walking. Elsewhere in the fortress, the war continued. The Imperial Fists fought in fragmented formations now. Squads had broken apart. Command hierarchies had frayed. Only proximity and instinct held them together. They no longer used standard formations. They moved like insects through a corpse, scavenging, striking, surviving. Each room they cleared felt more like a wound than a victory. Every now and then they encountered iron warriors, small, disciplined units who struck with methodical brutality. No screams, no cries, just death. But these were not reinforcements. They were remainders, phantoms of the trap's design. It became clear. The Iron Warriors were no longer truly fighting. They were watching, recording, cataloging every death, every movement, every flaw. Perturabo wasn't just trying to kill Dorn's sons. He was trying to understand them, to finish his thesis on pain. Back at the surface, a new message was received, a single astropathic burst, too garbled to trace, cut through the noise. It bore a signature of loyalist origin, and it ended with 2 words. They're coming. No one knew who. No time to reply, no confirmation. But it sparked a flicker of something the Fists had long buried. Hope. Not that they would be rescued, but that someone would see what they had done, that someone would remember. And still, Dorn moved, deeper. The corridors were narrowing now, the walls closer, the pressure mounting. But he was getting close. He could feel it. The center was near, the heart of the cage, the place where Perturabo waited. Not with an army, not with a blade, but with a truth. A final confrontation between 2 minds shaped not by love or hatred, but by rivalry old as empires. A war not just of brothers, but of ideas. Steel groaned beneath his feet, the wall before him shimmered, and the stone whispered one last time. You cannot endure this. Dorn stepped forward. Watch me. By now, there was no longer a front line, only fractures. The Eternal Fortress, so meticulously designed and cruelly orchestrated, had succeeded in its true purpose. It had unraveled the Legion. Not in loyalty, not in resolve, but in cohesion. The 7th Legion, paragons of precision, had been scattered like shards of glass across a battlefield that no longer obeyed the rules of space or sanity. They had not faltered, they had not surrendered, but they had been broken apart. Squads moved in isolation, Some operated in near total silence, conserving power cells and breath. Others fought their way through sealed halls for hours at a time without knowing if any of their kin still lived beyond the next corridor. They stopped marking time. They stopped counting bullets. Everything was survival now, dictated not by doctrine, but by the will to keep going, step after step, bolt shell after bolt shell, scream after scream. It wasn't chaos that plagued them. It was something worse, design. Every loss was calculated, every path pre-planned. Perturabo's cruelty had become mathematical, an equation written in suffering. He had found the formula to attrition, and the variables were Dorn's sons. And now the numbers were running thin. Sergeant Halbrecht's unit had once been 30 strong. By the 17th day of the siege, he led 4. They had no Medici, no Vox. They hadn't seen another living Astartes in over 2 cycles. Yet they still moved forward. They didn't know why anymore. Orders had long since stopped coming. There was no command grid, no fallback point. But in the quiet, there was the echo of Dorn's final briefing before planetfall. "You will go until the walls no longer stand," he had said. Not until victory, not until relief, until the walls no longer stood. So Halbrecht walked. They moved through a corridor of bone, literally. Whitewashed steel ribbing had been overlaid with calcium deposits, as if the fortress had grown a skeleton of its own. The floor beneath their boots crunched with ash. The air was heavy, not with smoke, but with memory, like it remembered every scream, every broken oath, and played them back in silence. The youngest of them, Brother Yaren, paused to rest beside a wall. He leaned back only to recoil with a hiss. Embedded in the wall, perfectly preserved in the metal, was the face of another Astartes, his features stretched in a frozen scream, his armor half fused to the structure. Not dead, not alive, trapped. "I think it's watching us," Yaren said, voice strained. "No," Halbrecht answered. "It's listening." They moved on. Elsewhere, Company Commander Voltin and the remnants of the 5th were fighting ghosts, not metaphorically. The Iron Warriors they faced no longer obeyed physical laws. Some flickered in and out of phase, their limbs distorting, their armor writhing with tendrils of molten data. Others walked calmly through walls, raising weapons formed from fused metal and warp-forged bone. These were not the same enemies that had ambushed them at fall. These were the results of long exposure to the eye of terror, of demonic pacts carved into flesh and function. Not all of them were even Iron Warriors anymore, not entirely. They attacked without fury, without joy. Their weapons sang with efficiency, their strikes surgical. They moved like programs executing preset commands. Valtin's men met them with what little ammunition remained. They fired until their bolters clicked empty. Then they advanced with blades, then fists, then teeth. When a legion is pushed beyond the point of war, it does not break. It becomes something simpler. It becomes instinct. And all the while, Rogal Dorn carved deeper. He no longer slept. If he closed his eyes, even for a moment, he risked seeing the things the fortress wanted him to see. Visions. Some showed terror, but not as it was, burning, hollow, shattered. Others showed his brothers, dead or damned, Guilliman's corpse on a battlefield of shattered data slates, Vulcan crucified beneath the ruins of a broken city, the Emperor himself speaking in voices not his own, his face split into thousands of weeping eyes. Each was tailored, each crafted to pierce his discipline, to burrow into the granite of his mind and widen the cracks. But Dorn did not flinch. He pressed on, one step at a time, deeper into the center of the nightmare. His armor was damaged, blackened at the pauldrons, gouged at the chest. One of his vambraces had been shattered and replaced with a crude plating of Iron Warrior scrap, bolted in place by his own hand. Storm's teeth, his chainsword, was dull at the teeth. Its motor stuttered. Still he carried it. Still he swung it. He did not lead anymore. He hunted. For Perturabo. For the end. They finally reached the gate. It was not made of iron or adamantium or even stone. It was made of memory. A great archway carved from scenes of their shared past, Dorn and Perturabo as boys, as warriors, as commanders. One side showed them standing together on Terra, overseeing the building of the first bastion. The other depicted them at the siege, separated by fire and blade. Between them, a throne. The final insult. Perturabo's voice echoed through the chamber. "You came to cage me, brother," it said, "but you've only brought yourself to judgment." Dorn didn't reply. The gate opened, not with mechanical locks, but with surrender. The walls themselves withdrew, like they feared what was coming next. Beyond lay the central chamber, the heart, the mind, and Perturabo. Back across the fortress, the battle reached a fever pitch. Whatever dark engine powered the eternal fortress had begun to burn too hot. The structure was failing under its own pressure. Collapse zones buckled. Energy surges melted doorways. Some iron warriors turned on each other in confusion, their control protocols corrupted by whatever unnatural forces had been tethered to the foundations. The Imperial Fists, even in their ruin, saw the shift. They pressed with renewed fury, not because they believed they could win, but because they had reached the breaking point where pain no longer mattered. They advanced with shattered weapons, with voices hoarse from chanting oaths, with limbs held together by scraps and memory. They advanced through fire and spite, because somewhere beneath it all, Dorn still fought. And so long as he endured, so would they. The fortress was failing. Perturabo knew it. He had overreached, overdesigned, overcommitted to perfection. But it didn't matter. The fortress was never meant to survive. It was never meant to hold back the tide. It was meant to make Dorn feel, to make him understand, to show him the futility of permanence, the lie of loyalty, the vanity of stone. Perturabo stood in the center of it all, surrounded by control thrones and data arrays shaped like gallows. His eyes burned, not with hatred, but with purpose. He heard his brother's footsteps, slow, certain, closer. The fortress was breaking, but the confrontation it had promised, that had just begun. The chamber was vast, not in the sense of scale, though it could have held a cathedral of the Imperial Creed within its walls, but in presence, it felt like a culmination, like an ending place, a conclusion drawn in architecture. The floor was polished basalt, black and veined with ancient circuitry that pulsed faintly with dying light. The air was still, almost reverent, as if even the fortress itself held its breath. Here, at last, in the very heart of the Eternal Fortress, the final moment arrived. Rogal Dorn stepped into the chamber, and the walls did not resist him. They welcomed him. Across from him, above a dais constructed not of iron, but of shattered relics, broken bolters, severed aquilas, cracked astartes helms, stood Perturabo, the Lord of Iron. His armor was a ruin of brutal elegance, a patchwork of demonic alloys and logic-forged plates, each etched with formulae and design runes whose meanings had long since bled into madness. Tubes pulsed across his back, feeding life into a body more steel than flesh. His eyes glowed like cold forges, twin coals burning not with hatred, but with grim vindication. There was no immediate violence, no roar of chainswords, no thunder of gauntlets. There was recognition, two Primarchs, two minds, born of the same genome, molded for war, broken by it in different ways. Dorn, impassive, bloodied, hollowed by loss. Perturabo, coiled with fury disguised as clarity. "I wondered," Perturabo said, his voice low, mechanical, stretched thin through vox cords and centuries of bitterness, "how long it would take you." Dorn said nothing. I built this for you, the traitor continued, gesturing not around but inward. Every hallway, every trench, every moment of suffering. I shaped it all in your image. You should be flattered. Still, Dorn did not speak. Was this what it took? Perturabo asked. An entire legion fed into the machine? Is this what you needed to feel something again? To stop pretending that loyalty is strength and realize it's just a word for silence? Dorn's voice, when it came, was a grind of stone, unmoved, final. You talk too much. Perturabo flinched only slightly. I talk because I was never allowed to speak. I built worlds, Dorn. You built walls. And yet you were praised, while I was buried beneath every failure the Imperium refused to acknowledge. You chose your path. I was never given one, Perturabo snapped. You, Gilliman, Vulcan, chosen, cherished, trusted. I was sent to bleed in the mud and asked to smile while I did it. You betrayed the Emperor. I did what I was made for. I destroyed. And now look, Perturabo swept his arms wide. I have created the greatest weapon in the galaxy, a fortress that thinks, that breathes, that learns. And I baited you here like a rat into the maze. And still, I am the villain. You are what you chose to be, Dorn said, and took another step forward. And all you've built will fall because it was never strength. It was noise. Perturabo's gauntlets flexed. The lights in the chamber dimmed. The fortress seemed to shift in response to his growing fury. I could kill you here, you know, he said. The power of this place obeys me. I have integrated my will into every surface. I can crush you before your next breath. Then do it. Silence. Dorn did not raise a weapon, did not ignite Storm's teeth. He simply stared at his brother, steady, immovable. And that was the crack in Perturabo's plan. He had envisioned this moment for decades. His war had never been for terror. It had been for this, for his brother's gaze to falter, for his voice to tremble, for the great Dorn to kneel in defeat before the monument of his failures. But Dorn stood, not triumphant, not mocking, just enduring, and Perturabo hated him for it. With a roar, the Lord of Iron launched himself from the dais. The floor shattered beneath his momentum. Lightning arced from his hammer. Forgebreaker, stolen from Pharis Manus, reforged and enhanced. It descended like judgment. Dorn met it with Storm's teeth. The impact was apocalyptic. Sparks burst outward in a corona of fury. The chamber groaned under the pressure of two gods colliding. Metal screamed, stone cracked, the fortress shuddered. Dorn struck with mechanical precision. Every swing calculated, measured, perfect. Perturabo fought like a storm, erratic, brutal, unpredictable. He was not art. He was trauma made flesh. Blow after blow rang out. The echoes were not mere sound. They were tremors of the past, vibrating through their shared blood. Every clash of blade and hammer told the story of the Great Crusade's promise and the heresy's betrayal. Every grunt and growl was a lost brother, a burned world, a dream crumbling into dust. You don't get to win, Perturabo snarled, parrying a vicious sweep. Not again. This isn't winning, Dorn replied, forcing his brother back with a crushing kick. This is what's left. The chamber's light began to fail. The circuitry embedded in the walls flickered. Sparks danced like fireflies. The air was thick with heat and hate. Blood dripped onto the black floor, some red, some something else. Both Primarchs were wounded, neither yielding. And above them, the fortress began to fail. Not collapse, not explode, but unravel. It had been built as a message, a monument, a trap, but it could not contain the very forces that birthed it. The warp stabilizers faltered, demonic sigils bled fire, floors twisted into new configurations at random, no longer responding to Perturabo's will. The weapon had become untethered, and still they fought. Storm's teeth carved a furrow into Perturabo's side, sparks bursting from split armor. Forgebreaker slammed into Dorn's pauldron, shattering ceramite, fracturing bone. Both staggered. Neither fell. "Why do you keep standing?" Perturabo roared, voice cracking under exertion and disbelief. Dorn's reply came not in words but in motion. He charged, not with fury but with inevitability. Their blades met one last time. The impact sundered the floor, cast both of them backward. Dorn hit the ground and rolled. Perturabo crashed into a monolith of data coils, crumpling it with his weight. But this time only one of them rose. Dorn. His chest heaved. His armor was cracked from throat to groin. His left hand hung broken, but his eyes burned. Perturabo groaned, dragging himself to his knees. He looked up into the gaze of the brother he could never surpass, never humble. "You should have fallen," he whispered. Dorn approached. "You should have stood," he answered. Then he turned. He did not kill Perturabo, not because of mercy, but because Perturabo had already lost the one thing he couldn't rebuild, meaning. The fortress collapsed around them, and the iron cage began to die. When the heart of the fortress fractured, the world followed. Sebastus IV trembled, not in sudden cataclysmic violence, but in the slow, grinding collapse of something ancient, something immense. The eternal fortress had been built to endure 1,000 invasions. It had never been built to outlive its purpose, and now that purpose had been fulfilled, or perhaps defeated. It began to rot. The command nodes flickered with static. Structural supports buckled beneath their own impossible angles. Tunnels twisted closed, gateways locked in recursive cycles. Power cores detonated one by one, not in rage, but like a body shutting down its organs. Across the continent-spanning ruin, the fortress died the way it had lived, with terrible, deliberate intent. But the Sons of Dawn were still inside, and they had no intention of dying with it. The remnants of the 7th Legion moved like phantoms through a world dissolving around them. They were few now, very few. Whole companies had vanished. Entire squads had gone into the labyrinth and never come out. Those that remained wore their survival like a burden. Their armor was burnt black, stripped of heraldry. Their weapons were low on charge, their blades nicked and rusting. But they still marched. Captain Grendel, once master of the 10th Company, now led a composite force of survivors from over a dozen scattered squads. They moved through a corridor collapsing in on itself, every meter a gamble. The walls hissed as coolant systems ruptured. The floor panels shifted underfoot. The fortress was folding in, trying to devour its children like a dying beast swallowing its own tail. But Grendel didn't slow. Neither did the Battle Brothers behind him. A Vox transmission, brief, scrambled, fragmented, had passed through the static an hour before. Just long enough to ignite something fragile and dangerous in the hearts of the remaining fists. Reinforcements were coming. They didn't know who. They didn't know when. But it didn't matter. They had something to move toward again. Hope. Not salvation. Not rescue. Just the possibility that someone might see what they had done. And that was enough. Above them, the sky boiled. The orbital battle was still raging. The Iron Warriors' fleet, though brutal and relentless, had lost cohesion. The Ultramarines had arrived, not in parade formation, but in vengeance. Robout Guilliman had brought his full wrath, not because Dorn had asked for it, but because he had not. Because Dorn had gone into the jaws of death without a word. And now Guilliman answered with fire. Strike cruisers punched through the blackened atmosphere. Blue-armored Thunderhawks screamed overhead, their engines howling like angels of judgment. Drop pods hammered into the fractured landscape, deploying fresh troops who found no front line, only chaos and echoes. What they found were stories written in blood, Sergeant Targos of the Ultramarines' 3rd Company landed amid a field of craters. He expected resistance. He expected gunfire. Instead, he found silence. And then he saw them. 7 Imperial Fists. They stood in a rough circle, backs to each other in a defensive formation. They did not fire. They barely moved. Their armor bore no company markings, only dents, burns, gouges. One of them held a standard. It was broken in half, but still upright. When the Ultramarines approached, one of the fists raised a hand. Not in warning, in recognition. "Help us dig," he said. It took Targos a moment to understand. They were digging a grave for one of their own. The fragments of the 7th Legion converged slowly, guided by instinct, by beacons, by half-heard commands through a broken vox net. They found each other in the ruins. They moved through collapsing corridors, leaping chasms where floors had given way, navigating by memory and blood. They found Dorn last. He emerged from the smoke like a statue stepping out of myth, bloodied, scarred, limping, but unbowed. His armor was fractured across the chest, one arm held against his side where bones had splintered beneath ceramite. He said nothing as his surviving sons knelt before him. He looked at them, these few, these scarred, these unbreakable, and he nodded once, not in triumph, but in recognition. They had endured, and that was all that mattered. The Ultramarines reached them within the hour. Guilliman himself stood at the forefront of the relief column, immaculate in his cobalt plate, his expression torn between rage and grief. When he saw Dorn, he stopped. The 2 brothers stared at one another across the ruin of a battlefield that had cost a legion. Guilliman spoke first. "You were never meant to go alone." Dorn's reply was simple. "No one else could have." That was the truth of it. This had never been a battle meant to be won. It had been a crucible, a reckoning between 2 visions of what it meant to serve the Emperor. Perturabo had built the cage to prove a point, that Dorn's loyalty was weakness, that walls and vows meant nothing. But Dorn had shown another truth, that strength was not in stone. It was in sacrifice, in refusal, in the willingness to bleed and crawl and die for something that could not be measured in numbers or strategy. That was the soul of the 7th Legion. Guilliman saw the ruin of the Imperial Fists and said what he had once sworn he would never say. "We were wrong." Dorn looked at him. "We were incomplete." There was no ceremony, no declarations, just understanding. Between warriors who had seen the edge of hope and walked past it. The decision was made not with words, but with action. Dorn knelt with his sons and began the division of the Legion, not because Guilliman demanded it, but because they had earned it. The iron cage had cost thousands of lives. It had nearly destroyed the 7th. But from its ashes, Dorn would forge something stronger, not larger, not more glorious, but leaner, fiercer, wiser. The Imperial Fists would endure, but so too would the Black Templars, the Crimson Fists, the Excoriators, the Hammers of Dorn. Each one a scar left by Sebastus IV, each one a memory, each one a promise. And far away, beyond the veil of sanity and stars, Perturabo retreated into the Eye of Terror. Wounded, defiant. He had not killed Dorn, he had not broken the Legion, but he had marked them. And in doing so, he had won a darker kind of victory, because even in defeat, the iron cage would echo. Through every drill the Fists ever endured, through every siege they ever survived, through every chapter Dorn would found with teeth clenched and jaw locked. The fortress had fallen, but its ghost would never leave them. They would carry it forever. There are wounds that never close, not because they bleed, but because they remember. In the years that followed the Iron Cage, the Imperial Fists were spoken of not as warriors, but as survivors. The fortress monastery upon Terra was rebuilt, but its banners no longer hung with the same brightness. The names etched upon its walls far outnumbered the living who remained to read them. And though the chapter endured, it bore a silence heavier than any stone they had ever laid. There was no victory cry from Sebastus IV, no triumphant return, no parades upon the landing platforms, only the thunderous hush of a legion that had been brought to its knees and chose with deliberate strength to rise instead of fall. Rogal Dorn had changed. So had his sons. It began with a question, asked not by Guilliman or Malcador or even a chapter master, but by an apothecary kneeling beside a field of gene seed canisters. Do we remain? The question was not about loyalty. The 7th Legion had already proven their loyalty in blood and fire, in sacrifice and silence. No one would ever again accuse the Imperial Fists of pride or disobedience. The question was about identity. How does a legion, bred for unity, bred to be the wall, survive after it has been shattered? How do they keep fighting, knowing their brothers lie in twisted bunkers, nameless and unmourned? Rogal Dorn answered the question himself in a chamber beneath the rebuilt strategium on the phalanx. He stood before a casket draped in yellow and black, the bones within unidentifiable, the armor scorched into oblivion. Around him were captains, fewer than a dozen, each one bearing the weight of the dead. We were meant to be whole, Dorn said, his voice worn thin. But what is whole can break, and what is broken must choose to end or to endure. No one interrupted. The Codex was born of fear, he continued, but it was not wrong. Guilliman saw the cost of singular strength, and now, so have we. He turned to the sarcophagus. Our strength will not be in how large we are, but how unyielding we remain, however we are divided. The wall is not a single stone. It is the line, the bond. He placed his gauntlet against the coffin. And so we will divide, not as surrender, but as proof that even scattered, we will stand. The process was swift. Dorn did not hesitate. He had already decided long before Guilliman's reinforcements had reached Sebastus IV. He had simply waited to see if any of them would live long enough to carry out the task. From the ashes of the Legion, chapters were born. Not copies, not reflections, echoes. Each was forged with a shard of the iron cage in its heart. The Crimson Fists who carried the burn of every orbital firestorm. The Black Templars whose zealous fury was kindled in the trenches where bolters melted and blades failed. The Executioners, the Fists Exemplar, the Excoriators, all bore part of the trauma. All wore it differently. The Phalanx itself, that great fortress ship, became the cathedral of memory. Not all of the newly formed chapters would share it, but they would all visit. They would kneel in its shattered halls and remember the price of Dorn's will. The broken stones of Sebastus IV were enshrined within, each one etched with the name of a fallen brother. No ceremony, no laurels, just truth. And the Imperial Fists who remained? They did not shrink, they sharpened. What had once been a legion of builders, architects, and bastion keepers became something else. Leaner, harder, more austere. Their training rituals tripled in intensity. The pain glove became more than a tool for reflection. It became a rite of passage, a spiritual forge. New recruits were not told of the iron cage in their first years, not in words. They were shown the records, the maps, the casualty reports, and then they were sent into the Wall of Martyrs, an internal gauntlet designed to mimic the worst of Perturabo's fortress. Most did not make it through the first time. Those who did emerged changed, and when they knelt before the shrine to Dorn, the light in their eyes was the same that had burned in his on the day he walked into the cage. It was not rage, it was resolve. Rogal Dorn himself was never the same. He rarely spoke after the battle. When he did, his words were as clipped and deliberate as chisel strokes. He did not issue lectures. He did not engage in philosophical debate. He rebuilt the chapter from the inside, piece by piece. He oversaw the forging of each successor, personally evaluated their commanders, trained neophytes in silence, showing them only how to stand and fight and fall without breaking. Some said he was haunted, not by defeat, but by victory, because what he had done on Sebastus IV, what his legion had endured, had worked. They had outlasted Perturabo's masterpiece. They had walked out of the grave that was built for them. But the cost was beyond reckoning, and to Dorn there could be no pride in survival when it came draped in the bones of the Brotherhood. Some questioned whether Dorn had allowed himself to be drawn into the trap, not out of necessity, but out of a need to prove something, to Perturabo, to the Codex, to himself. He never answered. He simply kept building walls, chapters, ideals, until there was no line between the man and the structure he had become. But the most telling change was this. The Imperial Fists never rebuilt the fortress on Sebastus IV. They had the coordinates. They had the firepower. Guilliman even offered a cleansing bombardment to erase the site entirely. Dorn declined. Instead, a single beacon was placed upon the broken world. It broadcast one message endlessly into the void. Here stood the line. It became a pilgrimage site, not for glory, for understanding. Those who walked among the craters of Sebastus IV did not speak. They left offerings, helm fragments, purity seals, the oath scrolls of the dead. It became hallowed ground, not because it was where the Imperial Fists had won, but because it was where they had refused to lose. And that, to Dorn, was always more important. In the end, the Iron Cage was never about strategy. It was never about victory. It was about will. Perturabo wanted to break Dorn, to prove that endurance was a weakness, that resolve could be dissected like a circuit and shattered like a wall. But all he did was prove how far Dorn was willing to go, how deep he could be buried without bending, how wide the Legion could be scattered and still remain one. That is the legacy the Cage left behind, not a battle, a doctrine, a scar beneath every fist's sigil, etched deeper than any wound. And as the Imperium bled into the long night, as the stars darkened and chaos reared again and again, the Sons of Dorn stood, not because they thought they would win, but because that was the point, to stand, always, until the fortress is ash, until the walls fall, until the end.